This is HOA outplayed. It started with snow and ended with a board meltdown. I am standing in my driveway in Ottawa holding a snow shovel when Debra comes storming across the street waving a clipboard and yelling that I am in violation of emergency snow removal protocols and I have 48 hours to pay a $200 fine or face a lien on my house. I moved to Crystal Drift 2 years ago for the remote software developer job flexibility and the promise of a quiet neighborhood. And for 18 months the HOA was just an annoyance. Monthly dues and the occasional passive-aggressive email about trash cans. Then last winter Debra got elected president of Crystal Drift HOA Incorporated, and everything changed. Now it is March, we just had the 4th storm of the season, and Debra has decided that selective enforcement is her personal hobby. The stakes are brutal. I am trying to sell this house. My buyer is already nervous about the HOA, and Debra is threatening disclosures and liens that will kill the deal. This morning I shoveled my driveway and sidewalk by 7, the same as I always do, and now she is standing 10 feet away in a red belted wool coat and a gray knit beanie, holding a handheld radio for calling the plow vendor, telling me my snow pile placement violates Section 12 of the Winter Maintenance Addendum. Debra says the pile is blocking the drainage path and creating a slip hazard for pedestrians, even though the sidewalk is completely clear and the pile is on my own property 3 feet from the curb. I ask her to show me the specific rule and she snaps back, "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule." That is her catchphrase. She has said it in at least 5 email threads and twice at board meetings. I take a breath and tell her I will review the addendum and respond in writing, and she cuts me off and says I can put you on the agenda and keep you there, which sounds like a threat, but I let it go because I know what is coming. I have been documenting everything for 3 weeks. Every email, every notice, every selective enforcement move. I have a quiet neighbor named Colin who saved screenshots of Debra's posts and messages, and between us we have a comparison photo set showing multiple sidewalks worse than mine with 0 fines. I have not told Debra yet because I am holding a trump card. I let her threaten a lien because that threat would look terrible on the record when I finally present the evidence. She turns and walks back across the street and I watch her go, and then I see the tow truck. It is the same truck that has been showing up every time Debra calls, a flatbed with a distinctive amber strobe that I have seen 4 times in the last 2 weeks. Twice for my neighbor across the cul-de-sac, once for the guy 2 doors down, and now it is idling at the corner with the strobe flashing. I feel my chest tighten because I know what this means. Debra is escalating. The HOA has been using amenities lockouts as punishment and leverage, cutting off pool access and clubhouse reservations if you question a fine, but towing is a new level. I pull out my phone and text Colin. Tow truck just showed up. Amber strobe, corner of Rideau and Frost. He texts back immediately. On my way, do not let them hook your truck. I go inside and grab my jacket and the folder with all my evidence, and when I come back out the tow truck is pulling up to my driveway. The driver gets out and walks toward my truck and I step in front of him and ask who authorized the tow. He pulls a work order from his pocket and shows me a signature. Debra Winters, Crystal Drift HOA President. The work order says unauthorized parking in a fire lane, which is insane because my truck is in my own driveway. I tell him that, and he shrugs and says he just does what the work order says. I ask him if he verified the fire lane claim, and he says that is not his job. I can see Debra watching from her front window across the street. I pull out my phone and take a picture of the work order, and then I show him the comparison photos on my phone. 6 different driveways in the neighborhood, all with trucks parked in the same spot, none of them towed. I show him a screenshot of an email from Debra 2 weeks ago where she told another resident that driveway parking was fine as long as the vehicle was registered. The driver looks at the photos, looks at the work order, and then looks back at me. He says I am going to call my supervisor. While he is on the phone, I see Colin coming up the street with another neighbor, both of them carrying salt buckets in hand, and I feel a tiny bit of relief because now I have witnesses. The time pressure is brutal. The HOA vendor says they will be on site in 1 hour to check the plow damage reports, and I need witnesses present to document what actually happened versus what Debra is claiming. Colin reaches me and sets his salt bucket down and says Debra already tried this on him last week, threatened a tow for snow pile encroachment. And when he asked for the written rule, she filed a complaint log entry that was obviously written in her voice, full of phrases like persistent disregard and community standards, which are her exact words from 3 different emails. The tow driver gets off the phone and says his supervisor wants to see the authorization paperwork before they proceed. He says he is going to head back to the yard and sort it out. I ask him for a copy of the work order and he hands it over, and then he gets in the truck and drives off with the amber strobe still flashing. Debra comes out of her house and storms across the street and demands to know why the truck left. I tell her the driver is verifying the authorization, and she says there is nothing to verify. The work order is valid, and if I interfere with HOA enforcement, I will be fined for obstruction. Colin jumps in and says, "Debra, you cannot tow someone from their own driveway," and she spins on him and says, "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule." I see the rage in her face and I realize this is not just about snow removal, this is about control. She has been using the winter rules to punish anyone who questions her, and now she is doubling down because she knows people are starting to push back. I go inside and call my attorney, a guy named Mark who has been advising me on the HOA sale disclosures, and I walk him through what just happened. He says if Debra authorized a tow from my own driveway without proof of a violation, that is potentially tortious interference, and if the HOA is doing this systematically, we might have a class action angle. He tells me to document everything and to file a formal appeal with the board and to make sure I show up at the next meeting with all my evidence. I tell him I already have the evidence packet ready and he says good, because the only way to stop this is to force it on the record. I hang up and look out the window and see Debra back at her house, still holding the handheld radio, talking to someone. I know she is calling the plow vendor. I know she is going to try again. That night I get an email from the HOA management company with a formal violation notice. The subject line says Final Notice Snow Emergency Noncompliance. I open it, and it is a 4-page document citing Section 12.3 of the Winter Maintenance Addendum, claiming my snow pile is blocking emergency vehicle access and creating a public safety hazard. The fine is now $500, and if I do not pay within 72 hours, they will place a lien on the property and refer the matter to the county for enforcement. I read the whole thing twice, and then I pull up the Winter Maintenance Addendum and find Section 12.3. It says snow piles must not obstruct sidewalks, driveways, or fire lanes. My pile is not obstructing any of those things. It is 3 feet from the curb, on my own property, in the same spot where every other house on the street puts their piles. I take screenshots of the addendum, the email, and the comparison photos, and I add them to the evidence folder. The next morning I wake up to another group text from Debra. The message says all residents are reminded that unauthorized community messaging is prohibited under Section 18 of the Communication Policy, and anyone found organizing against HOA decisions will be subject to fines and amenities lockouts. I stare at the message because the group text is the official neighborhood text chain that Debra herself set up last year for snowplow updates. Now she is calling it unauthorized because a few people have been using it to compare notes on her enforcement patterns. Colin texts me privately and says this is insane. She is trying to isolate everyone so we cannot organize. I agree, and I tell him I am filing the appeal today and I am going to request a hearing at the next board meeting. He says he will come with me and he will bring the screenshots. I spend the morning drafting the appeal. I cite the specific addendum sections. I attach the comparison photos. I include a timeline of every enforcement action Debra has taken in the last 4 weeks, and I reference the tow attempt with the work order as evidence of overreach. I email it to the management company and copy the entire board, and within an hour I get a reply from Debra. She says my appeal is noted, but it does not stay the fine, and if I do not pay by the deadline, the lien process will proceed. She also says I am being placed on the agenda for the next board meeting, and she expects me to appear in person to defend my position. I forward the email to Mark, and he says that is good, we want it on the record, but be ready because she is going to try to control the meeting. 2 days later, I get another email from the management company. This one says the board has scheduled a special compliance hearing for my appeal and it will take place at the clubhouse conference room next Tuesday at 7. The email includes a note that says all evidence must be submitted in writing 48 hours in advance, and any witnesses must be pre-registered. I call Mark, and he says that is a trap. They are trying to limit what you can present, but you should submit the evidence anyway, and bring your witnesses regardless of the registration rule. I send in the evidence packet, and I tell Colin to plan on coming with me. He says he already registered himself as a witness, and he submitted his own packet with the screenshots and a signed statement about the selective enforcement. If you are enjoying this story, please hit like and subscribe for more HOA drama. I have got a lot more where this came from. The weekend before the hearing, I go out to shovel after another light snow, and I see Deborah in her driveway with a shovel, pulling up the small orange stakes I put in last month to mark the edge of my driveway for the plow driver. She yanks them out one by one and tosses them into her yard, and when I yell at her to stop, she turns and says the stakes are illegal signage under Section 9 of the Exterior Modifications Policy and she is removing them for community compliance. I have my phone in my pocket, and I pull it out and start recording, and I catch her hand yanking the last stake out of the frozen ground. She sees the camera and freezes for a second, and then she says, "You do not have permission to record me on HOA property." I tell her this is my property, not HOA property, and she says the setback area is common space and I am trespassing on the record. She walks away and I stand there with the phone still rolling, and I can see her muttering into the handheld radio as she crosses the street. That afternoon I get a knock on the door and it is Deborah, holding a printed notice and a roll of packing tape. She tries to tape the notice to my front door while I am standing right there, and I open the door and she steps back and says this is official HOA business and I am required to post this notice in a visible location. I take the notice from her hand and read it. It says compliance hearing mandatory appearance and it lists the date and time of the Tuesday meeting, along with a warning that failure to appear will result in an automatic fine increase and immediate lien filing. I tell her I already received this by email and she says the policy requires physical posting. I ask her why she is posting it while I am home and she says because you have a history of removing official notices, which is a lie. I have never removed a notice. I tell her that and she says I have documentation, and then she turns and walks away. I close the door and look at the notice and I see it is signed by her, dated today, and marked urgent compliance matter. I text Colin and tell him about the notice and the stake incident, and he says Deborah is panicking, she knows the hearing is coming, and she is trying to build a paper trail to justify the fine. He says he talked to 2 other neighbors who are also being targeted, and they are both planning to come to the hearing as witnesses. I feel a little better knowing I am not alone, but I also know Deborah is not going to back down. She has too much invested in this. If she loses the hearing, it is going to look like she has been abusing her authority, and that is going to open the door for challenges on every other fine she has issued this winter. Monday morning, I wake up to a voicemail from my snow removal contractor. He says he is not coming back to my property because Deborah tried to audit his shovel path last week, claimed he was cutting corners, and threatened to report him to the city for unsafe snow handling. He says he does not need the hassle and he is dropping me as a client. I call him back and try to explain that Deborah has no authority to audit his work, but he says he already has enough clients and he does not want to deal with HOA drama. I hang up and I realize this is the side complication I have been dreading. Now I have no contractor. The next storm is forecast for Thursday, and if I do not clear my driveway within 24 hours, Deborah is going to hit me with another fine. I spend the rest of Monday preparing for the hearing. I print out the full evidence packet. I organize the photos into a binder. I write a 2-page statement summarizing the selective enforcement pattern, and I print out the email where Deborah said driveway parking was fine. I also print out the work order from the tow truck and the screenshots Colin sent me of Deborah's posts. By the time I am done, I have a 3-inch binder and I feel ready. Mark calls me that night and walks me through the hearing process. He says the board will probably try to limit your time, they will interrupt you, they will question your evidence, but stay calm and stick to the facts. He says the goal is to get everything on the record so that if they uphold the fine, you have grounds for a legal challenge. I tell him I understand, and he says good luck, call me after the hearing. Tuesday comes and I drive to the clubhouse at 6:30. Colin is already there, waiting in the parking lot with his binder, and we go inside together. The conference room is set up with a long table at the front and a few rows of chairs facing it. Deborah is sitting at the center of the table with 2 other board members, a man named Gerald and a woman named Stephanie. There are maybe 10 other residents in the chairs, most of them people I recognize from the neighborhood. Deborah looks at me when I walk in, and her face is tight, and I can see her hand resting on a stack of papers in front of her. I sit down in the front row, and Colin sits next to me, and at exactly 7, Deborah calls the meeting to order. She starts with a statement about community standards and the importance of winter maintenance compliance. She says the board takes safety seriously, and anyone who disregards the rules is putting the entire neighborhood at risk. Then she says we are here tonight to address a compliance hearing for the property at 42 Rideau Court, and she looks right at me. She says the resident has appealed a $500 fine for snow emergency non-compliance, and the board will now hear his defense. She asks me to stand and present my case, and I stand up and pull out the binder. I start by summarizing the violation notice and pointing out that my snow pile is in the same location as every other house on the street. I show the comparison photos and I pass copies to the board members. Debra interrupts me after about 2 minutes and says we have reviewed your evidence and it does not change the fact that your pile was blocking the drainage path. I ask her to define drainage path and she says it is outlined in the addendum. I pull out the addendum and read section 12.3 out loud, and I point out that it does not mention drainage paths at all. Gerald, the other board member, leans forward and says the drainage path is implied by the fire lane setback requirement. I ask him to show me where that is written, and he looks at Debra, and she says the board has discretion to interpret the rules as needed for public safety. I take a breath, and I say if the board has discretion, then I would like to know why 6 other properties with identical snow pile placements have not been fined. I show them the photos again and I point out the addresses. Stephanie, the third board member, looks uncomfortable and says those properties may have been compliant at the time of inspection. I ask her when those inspections happened, and she does not answer. Debra cuts in and says we are not here to litigate every property in the neighborhood. We are here to address your violation, and if you do not have any new evidence, then we will move to a vote. Colin stands up and says I have new evidence. I am a registered witness, and I submitted a packet on Friday. Debra says we received your packet and it is not relevant to this hearing. Colin says it is absolutely relevant. It shows a pattern of selective enforcement, and it includes screenshots of messages where Debra herself said driveway parking and snow pile placement were fine. Debra's face goes red, and she says those messages are out of context. Colin pulls out his phone and starts reading one of the messages out loud, and Debra slams her hand on the table and says this hearing is about compliance, not about board communications, and if you continue to disrupt the process, you will be removed. I see 2 of the other residents in the back pulling out their phones and recording, and I realize the whole room is watching Debra lose control. I step back in, and I say I would like to submit one more piece of evidence, and I pull out the tow truck work order. I say on March 9th, 2 days ago, a tow truck showed up at my property with a work order signed by Debra, claiming my truck was parked in a fire lane. I was not parked in a fire lane, I was parked in my own driveway, and when I showed the driver proof that other trucks were parked in the same location with no issue, he left. I pass the work order to the board and I say this is evidence that the enforcement is targeted and not based on any legitimate safety concern. Debra says the tow was authorized because your truck was obstructing emergency access, and I say my truck was in my driveway, where it always is, and you have never cited anyone else for the same thing. She does not have an answer for that. Stephanie says I think we should table this and review the evidence more carefully. Gerald nods and says I agree, this is more complicated than I thought. Debra looks at both of them and says we do not need to table anything, the violation is clear and the fine stands. Stephanie says Debra, I am not comfortable voting on this without more review, and I think we need to look at the comparison properties. Debra says we do not have time for that, we have 6 more hearings tonight. Stephanie says then we should reschedule, and Gerald says I agree. Debra stares at them, and I can see her calculating. And then she says fine, we will reconvene in 2 weeks, but the fine is not stayed and the lien deadline remains in place. I say that is not acceptable. If the board is not ready to vote, then the fine should be stayed pending further review. Debra says that is not how this works, and I say then I will be filing a formal complaint with the county and requesting an independent review. She does not respond, she just says the hearing is adjourned, and she stands up and walks out of the room. Colin and I walk out to the parking lot, and he says that went better than I expected. She completely lost it in there. I agree, but I also know Debra is not going to let this go. She is going to come after me harder now because I made her look bad in front of the board. Colin says he is going to talk to the other neighbors who are in the room and see if they will sign a joint complaint. I tell him that is a good idea, and I head home. The next morning I get an email from the management company. The subject line says, "Lien Notice Immediate Action Required." I open it, and it says the board has voted to proceed with the lien filing due to non-payment of the snow emergency fine, and the lien will be recorded with the county within 5 business days unless the fine is paid in full. I stare at the email and I realize Debra is moving faster than I thought. I call Mark and he says they cannot do that. The hearing was tabled and the fine is under dispute. This is retaliation. He says I am going to send them a cease and desist letter today, and I am going to copy the county clerk, and if they file the lien anyway, we will sue. I tell him to go ahead and I hang up, and then I see the tow truck pulling onto my street again. It is the same truck, same amber strobe, and it is heading straight for my driveway. I run outside and the driver gets out, and this time he does not even talk to me. He just starts positioning the flatbed. I yell at him to stop, and he ignores me. I pull out my phone and call the tow company directly, and when the dispatcher answers, I say, "You have a truck at my property right now and I need to speak to a supervisor immediately." She puts me on hold, and I stand there watching the driver lower the flatbed ramp. Colin comes running over from his house and he says what is happening, and I say Debra is trying again. The dispatcher comes back on and says a supervisor will call you back, and I say no, I need to speak to someone now. Your driver is about to tow my truck without authorization. She says the work order is valid. It was submitted by the HOA president. I said the work order is fraudulent. My truck is not in violation of anything, and if your driver hooks my truck, I will be filing a theft report with the police. She puts me on hold again. The driver is hooking the winch cable to my truck frame and I can see it stretched tight, and I walk up to him and I say, "You need to stop right now. I have proof that this tow is not authorized." He says I am just doing my job. I pull up the comparison photos on my phone and I show him the 6 other trucks, and then I show him the email from Debra saying driveway parking is allowed. He looks at the photos and then he looks at the winch cable and he stops. He says I am going to call my boss, and he pulls out his phone. I stand there while he talks, and a minute later he hangs up and says my supervisor wants to see the authorization paperwork before I proceed. I am going to have to unhook and head back to the yard. He releases the winch cable and drives off, and I feel my hands shaking. Colin says you need to file a police report right now. This is harassment, and I agree. I call the Ottawa Police non-emergency line and I explain what just happened, and the dispatcher says she will send an officer out to take a statement. The officer shows up 20 minutes later, and I walk him through the whole situation. I show him the work orders, the emails, the comparison photos, and the video I took of Debra pulling up my driveway stakes. He writes everything down and he says this sounds like a civil dispute, but the tow attempts could be criminal if there is no legitimate basis for them. He says I am going to contact the tow company and get their records, and if they cannot produce valid authorization, I will forward this to the fraud unit. He gives me a case number and he says keep documenting everything, and if they try to tow again, call us immediately. I thank him and he leaves, and I go inside and add the case number to the evidence folder. That night I get a text from Colin. He says I just got an email from Debra. She is calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow night to discuss member conduct violations and my name is on the agenda. I text back and ask what she is accusing him of, and he says disrupting a compliance hearing and unauthorized recording. I tell him that is retaliation and he should bring it up at the meeting. He says he is not going. He is done playing her game, and he is filing a complaint with the county HOA oversight office tomorrow. I tell him I will go with him and we can file together. The next day, Colin and I drive to the county clerk's office and we request the HOA complaint forms. The clerk gives us each a packet and we sit in the lobby and fill them out. I list every violation notice, every fine, every tow attempt, and every retaliation move. I attach copies of the evidence and I sign the form. Colin does the same. The clerk takes the forms and says they will be reviewed within 30 days and we will receive a response by mail. I ask if there is any way to expedite it, and she says not unless there is an immediate safety issue. I tell her about the lien threat and she says that is a civil matter and we would need to address it through the courts. I thank her, and we leave. Friday morning I get another email from the management company. This one says the board has scheduled a special meeting to discuss the compliance hearing appeal, and the meeting will take place Monday night at the clubhouse. The email says the board has reviewed additional evidence and they are prepared to make a final determination. I call Mark and he says this is good. They are moving faster than usual, which means they are nervous. He says bring everything you have and be ready to push for a vote. I tell him I will. Saturday, I spend the whole day organizing the evidence one more time. I print out the police case number, I add the complaint forms, and I make copies of everything for the board members. By the time I am done, I have 2 3-inch binders and I feel ready. Colin texts me and says he is coming to the meeting with 2 other neighbors who are willing to speak, and I feel a little bit of hope. Monday night, I arrive at the clubhouse at 6:45 and the parking lot is full. There are at least 20 residents inside, more than I have ever seen at a board meeting. Colin is there with his 2 neighbors, and I see a few other people I recognize from the first hearing. Deborah is at the front table with Gerald and Stephanie, and she looks tense. At 7, she calls the meeting to order and she says we are here to finalize the compliance hearing for 42 Rideau Court. She says the board has reviewed the additional evidence, and they have determined that the fine is valid and will stand. I raise my hand and say I would like to present new evidence before the vote, and she says the evidence review period is closed. I say you just said you reviewed additional evidence, so clearly the review period is not closed. Stephanie says he has a point. Deborah, if we are considering new evidence, then he should be allowed to present as well. Deborah looks at her and says, fine, you have 5 minutes. I stand up and I walk to the front, and I lay out the 2 binders on the table. I say I have documented every enforcement action the HOA has taken against me and 6 other properties in the last 4 weeks, and the evidence shows a clear pattern of selective enforcement targeting residents who have questioned board decisions. I open the first binder and I show them the comparison photos, the emails, the tow work orders, and the police case number. I say Deborah has authorized 2 separate tow attempts on my truck with no legitimate basis. She has pulled up my driveway stakes and claimed they were illegal signage, and she has threatened me with a lien while the compliance hearing was still pending. I pull out the video of her yanking the stakes and I play it on my phone, and I pass the phone to Stephanie. She watches it, and her face changes. Gerald leans over and watches it too, and then he looks at Deborah and says, "Did you really pull up his stakes?" Deborah says the stakes were a violation of the exterior modifications policy, and I was enforcing the rules. Gerald says, but you did not give him notice or a chance to remove them, you just took them yourself. Deborah says I had the authority to do that. Stephanie says, Deborah, this does not look good, and I think we need to reconsider the fine. Deborah says we are not reconsidering anything. The fine is valid, and the vote will proceed. Stephanie says I am not comfortable voting to uphold this fine, and Gerald says I agree. I think we need to overturn it. Deborah stares at them and says you are both overreacting. This is about 1 snow pile and 1 set of stakes, and the resident has been non-compliant for weeks. I say that is not true. I have been compliant with every rule, and the only reason I am here is because you have been targeting me for asking questions. One of the neighbors in the back stands up and says I have been targeted too. I got a fine for snow pile placement, and my pile is in the same spot as 10 other houses. Another neighbor stands up and says I got a tow notice last week, and I was not even home. My truck was in my garage. Deborah says this meeting is about 1 specific case, and we are not opening it up to general complaints. Colin stands up and says this is not a general complaint, this is a pattern of abuse, and I have screenshots proving it. He walks to the front and he hands Stephanie his phone, and she scrolls through the screenshots and then she looks at Deborah and says, Deborah, these are your messages. You are telling people the rules are fine, and then you are fining them for the same thing a week later. Deborah says those messages are private and you do not have permission to share them. Colin says they are not private, they are in the official neighborhood group text that you set up. Deborah stands up and says this meeting is out of order. I am adjourning until we can reconvene with proper procedures. Stephanie says, Deborah, sit down, we are not adjourning, we are going to finish this. Gerald says I move to overturn the fine and to issue a formal apology to the resident. Stephanie says I second. Deborah says you cannot do that without a full board vote. Stephanie says we have a full board, there are 3 of us and 2 of us are voting to overturn. Deborah says I am voting to uphold. Stephanie says then the motion passes 2-1. Deborah looks like she is about to explode, and then she says fine, the fine is overturned, but this is not over, and she walks out of the room. The room erupts in applause and Colin comes over and shakes my hand. Stephanie says I am sorry this dragged on so long, we should have looked at the evidence more carefully from the start. I thank her, and I ask what happens next with the lien threat, and she says the lien was never filed. Deborah was bluffing, and we will send you a written confirmation that the fine is overturned and the matter is closed. I ask if there will be any consequences for Deborah, and Gerald says we are going to call a special election to review her position, and in the meantime we are going to require actual evidence before any fines are issued. I feel a huge weight lift off my shoulders, and I thank them both. I walk out to the parking lot with Colin, and he says I cannot believe it, we actually won. I say we did, but I still have one more thing to take care of. The tow company still has my truck listed as an authorized tow, and I need to get that cleared. The next morning I drive to the tow yard and I walk into the office and I ask to speak to the supervisor. A man comes out and introduces himself as Dan, and I explain the situation. I show him the work orders, the emails, the police case number, and the board meeting minutes from last night showing that the fine was overturned and Deborah's enforcement was invalidated. He looks at everything, and then he says I am going to pull our records. He goes into the back and comes back 10 minutes later with a file, and he says we have 3 work orders for your property, all signed by Deborah Winters, and none of them have any supporting documentation. I ask him if that is normal, and he says no. Usually we require proof of the violation before we dispatch, but Deborah told us she had board authority, and we took her at her word. I show him the comparison photos and the screenshots proving the selective enforcement, and his face changes. He says this is fraud, she used our company to harass you, and I am going to cancel the contract with the HOA, and I am going to refund any charges we billed. I ask if there were any charges, and he says yes, we billed the HOA $300 for the first dispatch and $200 for the second, and I am going to void both and send a letter terminating the contract. I thank him, and he prints out a receipt showing the voided charges and he hands it to me. He says if Deborah tries to retaliate, call me. I will testify. I walk out of the tow yard office, and I see Deborah standing by her car in the parking lot. She must have followed me. She sees the receipt in my hand, and her face goes white. I walk past her and she says, "You think you won, but this is not over. I can put you on the agenda and keep you there." I stop and turn around and I say, "Actually, Deborah, that line is going into the meeting minutes as evidence of your intent to retaliate, and the board is calling a special election to review your position." Her mouth opens but no sound comes out. I say the tow company just canceled your contract and refunded the charges, and they are willing to testify that you committed fraud. I hold up the receipt and I say this is a documented appeal that overturns the decision on the record, and your own selective enforcement is going to be documented in the minutes as the reason the board voted to require actual evidence before fines. She stares at me, and then she gets in her car and drives off. I drive home and I text Colin and tell him what happened. He texts back, "That is perfect, she is done." I sit in my driveway for a minute and I think about how close I came to losing the house sale, losing thousands of dollars in bogus fines, and dealing with a fraudulent lien. But I documented everything. I built the case, I brought the evidence, and I forced it on the record. The HOA voted to require actual evidence before fines. Karen's own selective enforcement got documented in the minutes, and Karen called it a snow emergency, and the city notice disproved it when the police opened the fraud case. 2 weeks later, I get an email from the management company. The subject line says board election results. I open it, and it says Deborah Winters has been removed as HOA president by a special vote, and a new president has been elected. The email also says the board has voted to revise the winter maintenance addendum to require photographic evidence and written notice before any fines are issued, and all outstanding fines from the past 60 days are under review. I forward the email to Mark and he replies, "Congratulations, you did it." I sit back and I feel the relief settle in. My buyer closed on the house 3 days later, no lien, no disclosure issues, and I moved out of Crystal Drift the following week. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.